Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video lecture, we are going to introduce the idea of biodiversity and touch on a few of the concepts that are included under this very large heading. Now, there are many modules within the textbook. In fact, biodiversity is a theme that kind of permeates its way through the entire course, and this video is just giving you a brief introduction. Now, there are several levels of biodiversity. At the small level is genetic diversity. So within a particular species of organisms, in this particular diagram it's looking at chipmunks, not all chipmunks have the exact same sequence of DNA. There's a little bit of a variety. So some of them have slightly wider stripes than others. Some have a slightly lighter fur color. Some have just a random mutation that causes their metabolism to be a little bit faster. So there are not all the same in terms of DNA within a particular species. Then there is species diversity. So if you're looking at a particular location, species diversity is how many different types of things do you find living there? And then habitat diversity is looking at, in a larger scale, how many different types of habitats are found in a particular region. So why do we need genetic diversity? Maintaining genetic diversity is a huge focus in conservation biology, and that's particularly because they're concerned about what would happen if there was some type of disturbance to this particular species or to a particular ecosystem. So environmental change is this continuous process, and genetic diversity is really required for species to be able to overcome any types of changes that happen. Now, if you think back to past science courses, particularly your introductory biology course, you should remember that within individuals, and we're looking at the genetic diversities within a species, each individual has a random set of mutations that make them just a little bit different from all the other individuals of that species. Now, environmental change would weed out individuals that do not have these beneficial random mutations. So pretend that there is a group of individuals that have a random mutation that allows them to find food faster. Now, if there's some type of event that causes food to become scarce, the individuals that have this mutation are more likely to live long enough to have babies that also have that random mutation than individuals who don't. So over time, that population is going to shift to have that mutation be more common, and that is the process of evolution or adaptation. Loss of genetic diversity is often associated with inbreeding or some kind of reduction in reproductive fitness. Now, in these instance of inbreeding, that means you take two individuals that are already relatively genetically similar, and those are the ones that breed to pass on their offspring. So that means there is less likely that there's going to be some new mutation taking place and adding in there, and it's also more likely that if the individuals had detrimental or bad mutations, those are going to be passed on. So that leads to that reduction in fitness. Finally, more genetically diverse the population is, the better it can respond to environmental stress. Similar to what I was talking about with if you had a mouse that has the ability to find food just a little bit better. So how is the response to environmental stress really measured? Well, in science here, in environmental science in particular, we use the terms resistance and resilience, and that's what's being shown in these graphs here. So the ability to avoid negative impacts from some kind of environmental stress is resistance. So they are resisting change. They don't want to have anything altered. And that is demonstrated in the graph in the top left, which is labeled A. So at the time where the arrow points, there's some type of disturbance. Let's say there is a wildfire that moves through really quickly. Well, maybe this plant has very high resistance, so it doesn't burn quite as much as the plants around it, so the diversity or the density of that population stays pretty high. They're resisting change. Resilience, on the other hand, that is the ability to bounce back after a change or a stress has happened. And that is demonstrated in graphs B and C. So let's look at graph B first in the top right corner. In that instance, that particular population has very low resistance, but very high resilience. So let's go back to that wildfire scenario. Maybe they do burn off pretty quickly during that wildfire, so suddenly their population drops down. That's very low resistance to change. But maybe that wildfire allows their seeds to start to sprout and start to grow better, so they're able to bounce back really quickly. That would be high resilience. So we see initial drop and then a spike in the population. Graph number C has low resistance and low resilience. So this would probably want to be one of the more vulnerable species to any type of environmental stress. So something happens and their population tanks down really quickly and they don't have that ability to bounce back. Graph number D, that one is showing an opportunistic species. So whenever there is an environmental stress or a disturbance, this is a species that normally has very low numbers, but when there's this opening, they're able to take advantage of it really quickly, and they have this sudden burst or spike in their population levels. So what happens when there is a genetic bottleneck? What does this mean for our biodiversity? Well, when you have a genetic bottleneck instance or event, that leads to reduced genetic diversity. And that's illustrated in the diagram at the bottom of the screen here. So we start with our original population that has mostly yellow dots, but a good mixture of the reds and the blue in there. Now there's some type of event. So maybe that original population was the victim of severe poaching, and the population has been wiped down to a very small number of individuals. So all of those random mutations and the genetic diversity that were in the original population has been wiped out, and you only have the genetic diversity of those few surviving individuals to establish the rest of your population. So then there's a bunch of conservation efforts, and over time that population starts to recover and get back to a larger size. But if some type of other stressor might happen, they no longer have the original set of genetic diversity. So maybe a disease comes through, and the individuals that did have resistance to that disease were wiped out in the poaching. So this remaining population is now very vulnerable to having some kind of negative impacts because of this disease. Now, what happens when there is not habitat diversity? And these images, again on the right-hand side of the screen, show many of the niches that are located within a forest ecosystem. Now you have less habitat diversity, that basically just means less variety of habitat. Now species that require large territories, they are typically impacted by this because it's probably not as connected, and they're not able to access all of their food sources, all of their shelter sources that they normally would use. There's also going to be fewer specialist species. So perhaps there is a small minnow that only is found in slow-moving streams above a certain altitude. Well, if that particular section of the habitat is wiped out, now that specialist species cannot survive anywhere in there, so they're going to experience decline. You're also going to see a loss of generalist species. Now, the loss of generalist species usually happens later in time than the loss of the specialist species, but it does happen if there is this prolonged loss of habitat diversity. And also, having these losses in the habitat diversity can lead to trophic cascades. So when we think back to our food chains and food webs, if we have something such as a mountain lion that normally has a very large territory, is now not able to move throughout that entire area, that can start to impact the populations of their prey species, which can then impact the population of the plants in that community and other species, and we start to see that trophic cascade. So then how is biodiversity measured? There's two ways to really measure biodiversity. Scientists measure the species richness and the species evenness. So in this particular diagram here, we have community 1 and community 2. The richness is the number of different species in a given area. So both of these images are showing the same size area, but it's also showing different groupings of trees. If we count the number of different types of trees that are in community 1 and community 2, we find that they both have 4 different species. But species evenness is the relative abundance of each of these particular types of tree species. And we can see that community 1 is much more evenly distributed than community 2. We can apply a lot of these concepts of biodiversity to a whole host of other concepts. This diagram is particularly looking at how we can have livestock diversity to help with us cope with the changing climate. Now, if we have many different types of cattle, in fact, there are 800 breeds of cattle, some of them are better adapted to warmer, drier climates than others. So having this biodiversity can help make our food systems more sustainable and more resistant to changes within the climate. In summary, and I know this was a huge amount of information, this is just a broad overview here. We'll get into a lot of these topics again throughout this unit. Biodiversity is measured in the genetic, species, and habitat diversity levels. The more genetically diverse a population is, the better it can respond to environmental stress. Ecosystems that have a large number of species, so a large amount of biodiversity, those are the ones that are more likely to recover from disruptions or stresses. Loss of habitat can lead to a loss of individual species diversity, particularly genetic diversity as well, and it leads to a reduced number of the species that have the large territories. And finally, biodiversity is measured through species richness and species evenness. Make sure you understand the difference between those two terms. Please send me your questions and comments after watching this video, and I hope that you took good notes and were able to rewatch any parts of the video that might have been confusing or moved too fast. Again, we will dive deeper into all of this throughout the unit, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.